Hello and welcome to The Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by Spectator TV and broadcast on this Thursday, the 18th of April, 2024. My name is Freddy Gray. I am the Deputy Editor of The Spectator and I will be your host today. Coming up on the show this week, we are going to be talking about the rise of political prosecutions. Kate Andrews has written, this is our cover piece, Kate Andrews has written the cover piece about the various political figures all over the developed world who are increasingly facing police investigations or court trials that are clearly politically motivated. I'll be talking to Lionel Shriver, our columnist and the great novelist, about that, first of all. And then we will turn our attention to the Middle East. The world is holding its breath to see how Israel responds to Iran's attack on Israel last weekend. And I will be joined by Paul Wood, the veteran BBC broadcaster and frequent Spectator contributor, and the former diplomat and historian Charlie Gammell, who's an expert on Iran. After that, we will look to Europe and talk about the National Conservatism conference there, which was almost shut down this week by police who are acting on the orders of a local mayor who felt that it was an extremist gathering, even though it probably is not. I'll speak to Matt Goodwin, the professor and pollster, who was at that conference in Brussels. And then after that, I will talk to Ava-Santina Evans of Politics Joe about whether the EU has unmasked itself as a real tyranny. And finally, we will return to a popular topic on Spectator TV, which is whether or not we should ban smartphones from children. It's been in the news this week after Meta announced, Meta's the parent company of Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram, and they announced that they would be lowering the age at which children can use WhatsApp, the messaging service, from 16 to 13. I will talk to the writer Zoe Strimpel, who's written a piece for The Spectator about this, and our editor Fraser Nelson, who's very anti-tech on this issue. Before we get going, if you enjoy Spectator TV, and of course you do, you should subscribe to our channel, and you can do that by hitting the red subscribe button right now, and also hit the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. You get an alert every time there's an episode. And since it's spring, we have a new special offer for the magazine, for the best magazine in the world, I should say. It is being called a blooming good offer. You get 3 months of The Spectator for just £3. To get that amazing offer, visit spectator.co.uk/bloom. Now, this week, Donald Trump has been in the dock in Manhattan, facing the first to go to trial of his various criminal indictments. This is perhaps generally agreed that it's legally the weakest of the cases against Donald Trump, of the criminal cases anyway. But it is likely to be the first to be resolved and probably perhaps, before the election in November, which means that he could be a convicted felon by the time Americans vote on November the 5th. And this is part of a broader pattern internationally where we see increasingly politicians being pursued legally. It's often called lawfare. And I'm delighted to discuss this slightly alarming subject with Lionel Shriver, our great columnist and the author of a new novel that is called Mania. Lionel, what is going on here?
It's a way of political parties who are often behind these prosecutions, if not persecutions, are trying to win and to get around the voter. And that's certainly going on in the United States. Whatever you think of the individual cases against Trump, the larger package looks like, I'm afraid, what it is, which is the Democratic Party having decided that it doesn't matter how they do it, that Trump is such a danger to the Republic that he needs to be taken down by any means necessary. And it looks bad. It's like, we can't trust the voter. The voters might make the mistake of voting for a bad person, so we're going to do an end run. The Democrats have tried to take Trump off the ballot, and this is just another means of doing that. One of the things that really disconcerts me, though, in terms of voter perception, is that on the one hand, it's oft observed that every time Trump is prosecuted on one of these cases and he gets a lot of press on it, his support goes up. So, people rally around him. He seems like the underdog. He's being hounded. And so there's that. And then on the other hand, that polls also support that if Trump is ever convicted of anything, that there's a large number of people who wouldn't vote for him. Now, that's completely inconsistent. On the one hand, clearly, people are saying, I don't trust the justice system. It's being misused. This just makes me support him more. And then on the other hand, it's like, I trust the justice system so much that if you get a single conviction, I'm not going to vote for him. In fact, I might have voted for him and then I'm not going to, because that's how much I trust the justice system. So I don't know how to square those statistics.
And in Kate's piece, she talks about how this has come across the Atlantic. And I mean, I think it's been a feature of European politics for longer. And it's been a feature of banana republics ever since there have been banana republics, that, authoritarian figures can use the justice system to get rid of political opponents. But isn't this really the kind of a great flaw in democracy, that the law has to be above democracy to a certain extent? Otherwise, things just don't work.
Well, I mean, one of the favorite truisms in the UK especially is that, no politician can be above the law. And that the trouble is that when that's pursued to an absolute degree, you weaponize the law. Very few of us are perfectly compliant with statute. And I'm not going to tell you in which ways I'm not. But, and most of us get away with it. I am uncomfortable with holding politicians to such a puristic standard that most ordinary voters would not pass that standard. And I'm afraid that the case against Angela Rayner right now is pretty flimsy and petty. My larger concern, aside from this whole weaponization that we're talking about, is that when you expect your politicians to basically be perfect, so that you can't find anything in their background or any decision they've ever done, any tax return they've ever filed, they're perfect. Well, who's out there who's that perfect? And essentially you are discouraging people from running for office. It's not worth it because, there's this one little mistake I made. They're going to find it. I'm going to be crucified. And I'm all for holding people to account when they have committed grave errors and grave violations of the law. So yes, politicians should not be above the law. But I really object to petty persecution.
Well, it does seem pretty petty in the case of Angela Rayner, but the problem for her is that she's hoist by her own sanctimonious petard, because she, when Partygate was going on, when Boris was under investigation, she was quite busy saying, how can someone be prime minister? How can someone be in high office when they are under criminal investigation, when they're under police investigation? And of course, now she is under police investigation. And if you ask me, those were both quite petty things, although yes, they pointed towards hypocrisy. And that's what really gets people angry and motivates people to oust people, is the hypocrisy, not the petty tax misfiling or whatever.
Yeah, and the same thing applies to Scotland. I mean, after Alex Salmon was pursued with a case that fell apart on sexual impropriety. Then Nicola Sturgeon is also had the police after, still does. I guess that's not yet resolved from misuse of funds that were dedicated to the independence referendum. And you have to turn around and say, yeah, she deserves it. I mean, because these are the weapons that she's been wielding, and therefore it's fair game for them to be wielded against her. But this is an ugly spiral. It's really unpleasant to witness. It's kind of gladiatorial, watching them eat each other, and it's an unpleasant spectacle.
And it also feeds into something we talked a lot about, which is polarization and the culture wars to a certain extent, that everybody feels they're on one side. And if somebody else on the other side gets caught doing something, no matter how petty, it's satisfying for that side. And it's very hard for any of us, I think, to not feel that satisfaction, that kind of righteous anger when somebody that we perceive to be on the other side of a political fence or we've disagreed with about something is then found out to be or caught doing something, no matter how petty.
Yes, I mean both sides. I'm afraid we're living in a time of sides. Both sides are they tend to enjoy their gotcha moments, and I think that we need to step back and say, well, let's get a hold of this. Let's have a sense of proportion on both sides, because it always seems satisfying when your opponent is caught out doing something that perhaps they've been accusing the other side of, and yeah, that's hypocritical. But the whole theater is unpleasant and ultimately counterproductive. And I thought the height of that was, Partygate. Okay, Boris Johnson didn't follow his own rules. And okay, Keir Starmer had a beer and a curry and he wasn't supposed to. Honestly, I didn't care about the cake or the curry. I cared about the rules. I thought that was a situation where we really lost a sense of perspective, because what was wrong was the rules. What was wrong was lockdown and their incredibly petty requirements and the ultimate, gotcha moment, even in relation to ordinary voters. Everyone was supposed to follow these. Oh, you have to order a substantial meal with your pint, or, you're in tier 3 and you can't be in groups of 6. The whole thing was absurd. And that was really a moment to decide, look, these were lunatic rules. They didn't help epidemiologically at all. They did not help contain the virus, and they were an embarrassment. And now look, even our leaders couldn't follow the rules, or wouldn't, or didn't, at least. Let's settle on didn't. So let's do a big mea culpa on the whole regime rather than focusing on the cake and the beer.
It also drags the police into politics in a way that perhaps we haven't really seen before, that the police are now deciding whether or not accusations against a politician might end their career, because they can decide whether or not to launch the investigation. And this puts quite a lot of pressure on a police force that isn't really trained to do politics and shouldn't be.
I agree. I mean, I think it puts the police in an unenviable position. They feel watched, so that they feel driven to pursue the letter of the law, so that even if there's the tiniest infraction, then they have to go after it. Which again, it doesn't encourage the sense of proportion that I'm suggesting would be far healthier. I don't think legal systems work if you hold everyone to account for the absolute letter of the law in every respect. In fact, I don't think any of us want to live in that society where we wake up every day wondering about what am I doing wrong, and what rule do I have to follow now? And that's that's essentially a very totalitarian atmosphere, even if it's democratically arrived at. And I don't want politicians to live in that atmosphere any more than I want to live in that atmosphere. And I don't want to hold the police to account to pursue every tiny little infraction. I want the police, as I'm sure most of the people in Britain do, to start going after criminals, real criminals who steal your possessions and break into your house and defraud you or assault you on the street. Let's get to those people, and then maybe we can get around finally to whether or not Angela Rayner declared the wrong address on her electoral form.
And it ties into something a lot of conservatives in Europe talk about, which is the emerging tyranny of the judges. Because the judges are above the police, obviously the court systems are above the police, the justice system is. And this week, Liz Truss got as much mocked. She's being much mocked everywhere at the moment, but she was much mocked for saying she would get rid of the Supreme Court in England. But I mean, that is something a lot of conservatives feel when they look at what's happening with immigration, say, where there is a public appetite for something to be done about immigration. The government comes up with a plan, admittedly it's rather an odd plan, the Rwanda plan, and that is categorically blocked at every turn by a legal system that doesn't seem to want to be willing to let a government do something, pass laws that they have been elected to do and that the public clearly want them to do.
Yes, I mean, I read that Liz Truss piece, and honestly, I agreed with most of it. I would get rid of the Supreme Court, which, it's not some time-honored institution in the UK. It only dates back to Tony Blair, and it's just a naked imitation of the U.S., but the U.S. has a completely different structure of government, and there's no reason to import that idea here. And in general, I think most people understand there is something seriously wrong with the judicial system in the UK, in especial in relation to immigration. And it drives people crazy. So that we have activist lawyers who are usually funded by the government, ironically, and supported by NGOs, which get public money, so that you have the government thwarting itself. The taxpayer is paying so that the government that they elected is unable to institute the policies that they voted for. So, the legal system is completely tied up in knots in relation to immigration. It seems to be virtually impossible to deport anyone from this country. And I'm actually sympathetic with the government on this point, which has been incompetent on any number of fronts. But I believe that the desire to at least check illegal immigration is sincere, and they haven't been able to get anything through. And and even when they do have a policy in place, actually instituting that policy on a granular level, in terms of individuals wanting to into this country, it's just complete paralysis. Nothing happens. You have these flights even previous to the Rwanda policy, all ready to go, and then everyone troops off the plane, and at best you spend £1 million to send one person out of the country. It's an embarrassment, and it's clearly a systemic problem. And I'm not quite sure what the answer is, but I would start by dismantling some of the elements of the court. I'd get rid of the Supreme Court, and of course, I would withdraw from the ECHR.
You mentioned the obviously politicized nature of the American justice system, where you have people who are elected in positions of legal authority, and you have a Supreme Court where presidents nominate the justices to the Supreme Court, and then they're voted on. The justice system is clearly intertwined with the political system in a way that it isn't meant to be here. That said, does it surprise you that it's taken this long for America to get to a situation where political opponents are being so obviously pursued for political reasons in the courts?
I suppose the mechanism has been there all along, and it's been merciful that the legal system hasn't been that weaponized in presidential elections in the way that it is in this one. So that expresses a certain functional restraint. And I would love to go back to that because it makes voters feel out of control, and it has a texture of skullduggery.
Is it because up until quite recently, most people were constrained by a sense of right and wrong as far as the legal system?
Oh, that's so old-fashioned.
Yeah, that's very old-fashioned idea of right and wrong. But I mean, there's always been disgusting skullduggery in politics, but it hasn't been quite so naked as far as the justice system is concerned until now.
Well, one of the things that's going on now is that you have a degree of self-righteousness on the part of the Democratic Party that I think it's at new heights. Democrats have always tended to be a little bit more sanctimonious than Republicans, but now they are really filled with the fires of righteousness. Trump is the Antichrist, and there's no self-questioning on the part of the Democrats. There's no, should we do this or how does this look? They don't care. They will do anything to keep Trump from being president again. And they believe, it's the secular version of feeling chosen by God. This is an existential moment. We will not have democracy anymore. They genuinely believe that Trump is a demagogue in waiting, that indeed, if he is elected again, he may never leave office, that he will install a dictatorship and take the arms of government and persecute his foes. And therefore, in the service of keeping him from doing that, they are using the arms of government and persecuting their foes. And it's hugely ironic, but I still think it looks bad. I believe that process here is still more important than personality. I would rather live with 4 more years of Trump than see the process of government in the United States completely corrupted. I mean, I think there's a great deal of evidence that the Biden administration has been employing the FBI, the IRS, the tax authority, and the CIA against political opponents. And that kind of corruption has certainly happened very commonly on a lower level, but not so nakedly on a national level.
And that kind of corruption demands, in some ways, an authoritarian response, because, as Donald Trump always says, he must get revenge on the deep state. He must destroy the factions, the institutions, the networks of power that have been trying to destroy him for so long. And a lot of people sympathize with that because the system is obviously corrupt. And the only way to counter it is through some degree of authoritarianism. So it creates the very thing that it's pretending to. Well,
the Democrats are acting in an authoritarian way, and they are setting the precedent. If Trump were to get back into the presidency, they have already set the precedent for weaponizing these institutions, for weaponizing the State Department to go after one's enemies. They've already done it in the same way that they set the precedent for questioning the results of a presidential election. I mean, in 2016, Hillary rejected Trump's election as, quote, illegitimate. And therefore, Trump did the same thing in 2020. The Democrats got there first.
I think there, Lionel, just to end on this now. I think I picked up that you were saying you'd rather have 4 more years of Trump than 4 more years of what the Democrats are doing. Is that right?
I want to see the institution of the U.S. federal government preserved with some integrity. And if that's at the price of 4 more years of Trump, which I couldn't be less enthusiastic about, then that's a price worth paying. The process of a relatively just American government that obeys the rules, at least roughly, is more important to preserve than which party is in power, however temporarily. And that's what's upsetting me on the Democratic side, that they are willing to throw out the principles of democracy in order to save democracy. And I don't believe that works.
On that note, we'll end it. Thank you very much, Lionel Shriver, for coming on to Spectator TV. Now, the world appears to be closer than it was to World War III since the last episode of Spectator TV, after Iran launched a bombardment of drones and missiles at Israel over the weekend. Most of these were shot down, as was widely reported. But Israel is now talking quite fiercely about retaliatory action, despite much of the international community urging Israel to show restraint. I'm delighted to be joined by Paul Wood, who is a former Middle East correspondent for the BBC and a frequent Spectator contributor, and the historian Charlie Gammell, who also used to work on the Iran desk at the Foreign Office. Paul, let's get onto your piece in a bit, but let's just start with the news of it. Obviously it's very easy to start talking about World War III and sounding hysterical. How significant do you think the escalations of the last few days are?
Well, we've had a series of unprecedented events, the main one being that Iran chose to attack Israel directly from Iranian soil and not to bother with any of the proxies it's got around the region. That is a completely new strategic paradigm, as it's been called, for the Iranians, and has invited an Israeli response. And although that response hasn't come, it's universally expected. Lord Cameron was confirming it this afternoon, he's in Israel, that Israel will do something. Deterrence is of central importance to the Israelis. They believe they can only ever lose one war, and they don't want to have to fight that war, and therefore they need deterrence. And the direct attack from Iran was a red line for Israelis. I think there's unanimity among the Israeli military, the political class, and the public too. Something has to be done. The question is what? Benjamin Netanyahu has frequently, we are told, over the past 25 years of his political career, wanted to attack Iran. He's apparently put forward proposals for such an attack at earlier stages in his premiership. He's been around for a very long time, but been vetoed by the Americans. He wants to stop the Iranians getting a nuclear weapon. So the question is, does he go all out? Does he go berserk, in the words of one of his cabinet ministers? Or does he listen to President Biden, take the win, and yes, attack Iranian soil, but do something entirely symbolic that doesn't cause casualties and that doesn't humiliate the Iranians, this is a very important point, and require them to answer back?
Charlie, the Iranian attack was itself a retaliation for Israel's strike in Syria on the Iranian consulate there, which killed, I believe, 13 people, including 2 very senior Iranian military commanders. That was an act of aggression that a lot of people are suggesting was a desperate move from Netanyahu to invite a response from Iran and almost win back international sympathy in Israel's favour. Is that sort of talk conspiracy theory?
I definitely don't think that's conspiracy theory. I think there's a sense, and Paul, you've spoken about this in your article, that Iran is unpopular in the region amongst Arab powers. There is a consensus that's what led to the Ibrahim Accords, that an alliance with Israel against the common threat of Iran, or the common enemy of Iran, is something that would be in the region's interest. So I definitely don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility. Israel was behind on the narrative. The numbers of Palestinian civilians that have been killed, obviously the aid workers, their deaths that came shortly after they struck Damascus, they were very much behind the eight ball. Netanyahu was under huge pressure from the White House to stop civilian casualties in Palestine. So to forge alliances with against a common enemy in the region, and you could say that Israel's been very successful in that, because the robustness of the alliance that emerged to counter Iran's attacks on the weekend is a pretty strong show of strength from North America to Europe to the Middle East. So the response to what Iran did would indicate that Israel's calculations do have some logic to them. I suppose, looking at it, I would say that there's a short-term viability to that alliance, and the point at which the war in Gaza continues in parallel, I think that will really test the bonds of this alliance between Arab states and Israel and the West.
And I'll put this question to you both, Charlie first and then Paul, isn't part of the story here, a big part of the story here, the ineffectiveness of America and the West to actually shape what's going on in the Middle East? Because if you look at Joe Biden, he says to Iran one word, don't, and then Iran does. Israel doesn't seem to be listening to the calls for restraint. It certainly hasn't previously in Gaza. Is that the real story here now, that the West is not really able to shape events, and other powers, like China, like Russia, are perhaps shaping events in ways that we don't like?
I definitely think there's merit in that. I think if you look at one of the most significant events in the Middle East after the Ibrahim Accords and before the 7th of October was the strategic alliance forged between the Saudis and the Iranians. China was instrumental in bringing that about. But I mean, China's been quite absent since October the 7th. It hasn't really brought much diplomatic heft to resolving this situation. But I think you're absolutely right that it seems that no matter what the Americans say to the Israelis, their behavior continues along a particular path. And obviously, no matter what the Americans say to the Iranians, their behavior continues on a similar path. And whilst you would understand that America has difficulty in persuading Iran to do certain things because it lacks the incentives, this is no longer a JCPOA world where America can incentivize Iran into behaving as it would like it to, given, as we spoke about, Iran has ties with Russia, it has ties with China. But you would hope that America would be able to rein in Israel. And I think that will be obviously the challenge going forward. And Lord Cameron has indicated that Israel will push back. Now it's the real task of diplomats around the world to refrain Israel from hitting back in a way that would provoke another Iranian response.
Paul, Charlie mentioned the JCPOA there, which is the Obama-era deal, nuclear deal with Iran to kind of try and constrain its nuclear development through an agreement. Again, when it comes to that, Biden has followed on in Obama's footsteps to some extent on Iran by trying to sort of ease sanctions on it and so on. And this appears to have blown up in his face. Again, I put the similar question to you. Is the story here not Joe Biden's impotence on the world stage?
Well, the Americans have been writing blank checks, which the Israelis are now cashing. They sent carrier groups to the region. Joe Biden publicly embraced Benjamin Netanyahu and said, we stand shoulder to shoulder with you and we're with you to the end. So it's an interesting question to me whether, for instance, the Israelis sought advance permission or informed the Americans in advance of the strike on Damascus, which was highly likely, as you say, to provoke an Iranian reaction. Another interesting question for me is, what's Benjamin Netanyahu's real thinking here? He is, despite appearances, quite a cautious operator, but has been taking a number of risky steps. And the cynics would say, well, if he isn't fighting a war, he's stepping down from power and then he's going to jail. He faces 3 different corruption inquiries. So Israel seems to be embarked on an incredibly risky course. The United States does have influence. Presumably, Israel would have acted more forcefully than it has. Ultimately, President Biden can, though, pick up the phone and say, stop in Gaza, stop even against Iran. That's what President Reagan did in 1982. He told Itzhak Shamir to stop the invasion of Lebanon, and the Israelis really had no choice but to comply. The bombs that Israel drops come from America, the weapons system, the Iron Dome components. Billions of dollars worth of weapons are now stuck in Congress. They're probably moving again now. So America does have tremendous influence. And if Mr. Biden looks ineffective, there's probably a lot more going on behind the scenes. But the action that Israel is about to take against Iran, that will be the measure of really how much influence Mr. Biden has. This may have happened between when we record this and this broadcast. We'll have to wait and see.
When in your piece you talk about this Arab realignment that has been discussed a lot in recent years, but it was really seen in action at the weekend because Jordan helped shoot down the missiles that Iran fired at it, which is quite a risky thing for Jordan to do in many ways. But it showed that following the Abraham Accords, which Charlie mentioned, the deals that Jared Kushner helped facilitate, Trump's son-in-law when Trump was president, that following them, there is an alliance between Israel and the Gulf state, a strategic alliance, a tentative one you call it, but it is nonetheless highly significant, is it not?
Well, there's a solid treaty, the Abraham Accords, between the UAE, Bahrain and Israel, and that's Jared Kushner's achievement. Everybody likes to laugh at Mr. Kushner, travelling to Iraq in his Omani sunglasses and putting his flak jacket over his Brooks Brothers button down. But that was a real achievement, an astonishing achievement that a lot of people didn't expect. Maybe, as I say in the piece, it's because Henry Kissinger was advising him. Maybe he was just underestimated all along. So that's one of the building blocks. And of course, Saudi Arabia was positioning itself to sign up to the Abraham Accords. In one way, this is all new. In another way, this is the fundamental division in the Middle East reasserting itself, that between Sunni and Shia and the Arab states and Persia, of which they're very suspicious. And despite the awful bloodshed which rightfully rivets our attention in Gaza, Israeli-Palestinian conflict is something of a sideshow to that more fundamental conflict throughout the region. And that's what we're seeing emerge here. Jordanians, who are conservative Sunni Arabs, don't particularly like Iran. The Saudis are fearful, especially of a nuclear-armed Iran. MBS would not like to see that. And so they're not acting out of any love for Israel. This is a reluctant alliance. They're acting in their own interests. But perhaps the most significant thing we saw at the weekend was, as you say, and as I write in the piece, Jordanian fighter planes defending the borders of Israel.
No, I'm just going to add a few things to that idea that the common enemy in the Middle East obviously is Iran, and that's shared amongst the Arab nations. I remember when I served as a diplomat in Morocco, talking to my counterparts from the Arab nations and particularly in the Gulf, that consensus did shine through. Actually, Iran is our enemy, or Iran is our strategic foe, I think, in the region, and an alliance with Israel makes sense. In that sense, there is also another element to it, which is a little bit more pragmatic, which is these Arab states, Gulf states, they're really interested in the tech dividend that they can get from Israel on the defense side and on the non-defense side, and on the kind of just developing their countries. And they see that as a potential carrot in this relationship. So I think that's really important. But I think to add to that is not that comes at a cost to their reputation at home, and it came at a cost to their reputation at home, given what's going on in Israel-Palestine. But even more so now, I think that cost has gone up a little bit. So it's a less straightforward deal than I think it was previous to October the 7th. Now I think, given a certain element of sort of restiveness on the Arab street, little bits of support for what Iran is doing to Israel, that has to be factored into to how this accord moves forward after what happens in Gaza.
Paul, we tend to think of these accords because they do represent a thawing of relations between previously hostile states, and not just the accords, the sort of the more strategic sotto voce alliances between Israel and Gulf states. We tend to think of them as moves towards peace because they're not aggressive. However, could you look at it in another way and say that because of these accords, because of this growing alliance, Iran isn't just isolated or isn't isolated, it is more hostile and more aggressive, and that in fact we may have created two extremely antagonistic power blocs? Yeah,
the Abraham Accords are an alliance against Iran. and therefore potentially a war-making alliance. Although, as I say in the piece, the Arab states haven't really signed up to what may be coming, and everybody's fate is tied to that of Mr. Netanyahu, the Americans, all these Arab states. What is Mr. Netanyahu and Israel's military establishment going to do next? Mr. Netanyahu spoke of the nervousness that there must be in Tehran, and you get the sense the Israelis are enjoying making the mullahs sweat a bit, but there's a lot of nervousness around the region as well, including among these allies. We'll see how long they last if something really massive is planned by the Israelis.
And Charlie, if, as Paul said, it could happen by the time this is broadcast, but if the Israelis strike back, the Iranians have said they will hit back even harder. And of course, that would bring in Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has thousands of missiles, as Paul says in his piece, pointed at Israel. And it may be much harder to stop that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is how what the weekend showed us was that Israel has an ability to protect itself against a certain number of drones and a certain number of missiles. The Iron Dome is not going to stand up so well to missiles coming from the border, sort of from Hezbollah territory into Israel. So I think that there is an acknowledgement that Iran is probably not particularly well placed to fight a conventional war against Israel, but it is much better placed to fight this war from Lebanon into Israel. And I think that's the real area where Iran can be very, very dangerous to Israel, and not only dangerous to Israel, but also through different proxy forces that they have in the region. And that suits Iran. There's been lots of very amusing memes and jokes on the Iranian internet about how the rockets didn't get there because they stopped to pray. And they probably, if we'd fired some cucumbers, it would have been more. It would have had more of an impact. And that's a large section of the Iranian populace poking fun at the Islamic Republic. There was graffiti on the walls of certain places in Tehran saying, "Israelis, please strike Mr. Khamenei's house." And again, that's all sort of fun and games, but the seriousness of that feeds into why Iran does not want a big war. It doesn't want rockets coming down on Iranian territory because, to a degree, the Islamic Republic is on potentially shaky ground with its own people. That's not just the sort of Masa Amini protest, but it's also with Kurds, it's also with Arabs. And I don't think the Islamic Republic feels that it is as strong as it was in 1980 when Saddam attacked, where there was that sort of wellspring of nationalism that could rise up and repel an actual invader. I think there's a sense in the Islamic Republic that popular support wouldn't be able to carry Iran through a war of the cities that happened, for example, a replica of the war of the cities that happened in the 1980s. So you saw the IRGC coming out very quickly as the drones were in the sky saying, this is it as far as we're concerned. So I think an Iranian response would very much keep it within the confines of the existing conflict on Israel's borders.
In theory, yes. I mean, supposedly what Iran did on Saturday was telegraphed in advance, carefully choreographed, carefully thought out not to go too far and not to provoke too big of a response. It's a very inexact science, if that were true, flinging hundreds of missiles and drones at Israel, some of which could have landed in Jerusalem on the holy sites, some of which could have hit a residential tower block. It's only the merest chance that one of those didn't get through and cause hundreds of casualties. So perhaps the Israelis are doing a mirror of that calculation. Where can we hit that will go this far but not too far? But really, both sides are only one miscalculation away from something which nobody can stop, and that's the risk we're in now.
Well, on that terrifying note, thank you very much both for your fascinating and alarming analysis. Now, this week, police in Brussels tried to shut down the National Conservatism Conference, which is a gathering of right-wing thinkers and politicians and includes speakers such as Nigel Farage, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Suella Braverman, and even Michael Gove. And it was shut down because a mayor in the city decided that it was threatening and far right and sent in the police to try and close it. And this provoked a furious uproar, including from Matt Goodwin, the professor and author of Values, Voice and Virtue, The New British Politics. And he wrote a piece in the Daily Mail about this attempted closing down of the conference, in which he said, what we witnessed yesterday in Brussels was a historic unmasking of the EU for what it really is, a would-be tyranny. That's quite a strong statement. Matt joins us now from Brussels. Matt, why do you think that this proves the EU is a would-be tyranny?
So the fact that the conference was even happening at all was pretty remarkable. And to be in Brussels, the capital of essentially the European Union, and to see this happening in what was a fairly mainstream debate about conservatism, actually. There was nothing fringe or cranky at this event. It was discussing mainstream issues, migration, nation, family, but nonetheless the police rolled in at 2 p.m. yesterday and issued a public notice and essentially tried to force the conference down, and they tried to shut the public square down, and they were unsuccessful in the end. People basically refused to leave the building, and they went to court last night and won that case at 10:30 p.m. last night. So it's a victory for free speech and a defeat for the mainly left-wing mayors and Antifa who tried to shut it down.
And I'm very sorry about the rather shonky audio quality there. Perhaps the Mayor of Brussels was trying to interfere with his signal. I'm also joined by Ava-Santina Evans of Politics Joe. She's the political correspondent for Politics Joe. Ava, what do you think about what Matt's saying there? Do you think he is a victim of a tyranny?
I broadly agree with what Matthew Goodwin had to say, but I'm not quite sure about it being anything to do with the EU, actually, because if you look at what the Prime Minister of Belgium said quite quickly after the mayor had tried to shut it down, the Prime Minister was vehemently against the move. But the whole thing reminded me, so I cover a lot of protests for Politics Joe, and it's an under 35 outlet, and we're often covering either the Palestine protests or we're covering strikes, and so I've dealt with quite a lot of police and how they deal with protests and how they intervene and, at what point they try to cut them off. And this actually really reminded me of quite a lot of what we've seen in London over the past 6 months or so, actually probably bordering on nearly a year and a half now, where there seems to be an intervention from the police that directly flies in the face of free speech. And so, on that front, I totally agree with him, but I don't think it's wrapped up in the EU or something that they're trying to do.
Yes, it's not even protest, though, is it? It's a kind of it's meant to be an intellectual conference.
Yeah, but I think it does seem sort of like a protest, doesn't it? Because I think the way that it was being billed was this, this huge flagship conference where people were going to say outrageous and outlandish things, and that's got some of the similar themes that you might see at a protest, or they were protesting the right way to be speaking, right?
Yes. Well, Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary and darling of centrists everywhere, got himself in a bit of trouble yesterday because he was sort of laughing in Parliament about what was happening at this conference, and a lot of people on the right found that very offensive. What did you make of that?
Well, I think that they were right to be alarmed by it, but I think that they got the wrong end of the stick. So I was thinking, if you take the premise that Wes Streeting is a Blairite, and Blair introduced some of the most draconian and even, you could say, actually authoritarian restrictions on speech during his premierships. I mean, you had the Terrorism Act of 2000, and within that, it meant that if you were going to protest outside Parliament, and when I say protest, I mean hold a placard outside Parliament, you could be arrested. And then that's sort of been built on by successive governments ever since. And actually, a lot of what Suella Braverman has introduced has been built off the back of those pieces of legislation. And so what was worrying to me was that not the celebration of, this sort of quote unquote far right, I don't agree it was a far right conference, but this right wing conference has been shut down, and he was gloating at that. And I actually think it could be interpreted as more sinister than that. It's actually sort of falling in line with those Blair policies and could be a sign of what will be what could come with the Labour government. It could be more of an infringement of free speech.
You are someone, Ava, who I would say is on the left of politics. I hope you don't mind me saying that. And obviously this is something that's happening on the right, and you disagree with it. Conservatives like to use this slightly ridiculous phrase, the Overton window. You heard them say that? That's sort of always narrowing, and it means the acceptable parameters of discussion are always narrowing, and so their opinions are increasingly. But it closes in both directions, doesn't it? Because a lot of people on the left, talking about protests and so on, they feel that it's really the centre that is the tyranny. And it's people on the left and the right that are increasingly branded as extremists when they're not necessarily that.
Yeah, and actually, we just had a little bit from Matthew Goodwin there, but his book talks about this a lot. I'm not going to say that I necessarily agree with everything that he has to say in that book, but I think he's right to say that in the centre ground, and I think he points towards the elites on the centre left who are running the civil service and making decisions, but actually it's both sides of the centre who are sort of pulling that Overton window in closer, and so it means that if you are on the left, further left, and say you want to go and protest Palestine, or you would like to go and, strike, or you would like to fly a placard in Westminster, actually your freedoms have been curtailed quite seriously in the last couple of years. And what's interesting about that is actually a lot of that has come from Suella Braverman. And you wonder if now that perhaps she's had this happen to her, perhaps it might change her way of thinking about, some of the, the Police Crime and Sentencing Bill and the Public Order Act that she oversaw at least some of the last stages of.
Yes. On protests, particularly with Gaza and Palestine protests in London at the moment, there's quite a good case to be made that after a certain point, it's public nuisance should supersede, because if you're shutting down central London every weekend for a number of weekends, central London's a bit of an exaggeration, but important parts of London for numerous weekends in succession, then your protest can be stopped. Do you agree with that?
But how would you define? I think defining public nuisance in law is very dangerous, because if you look at some of the Blair reforms that came in immediately in the aftermath, where he began to curtail protest and he brought in this sort of harassment clause, there were the most ridiculous arrests being made. I mean, at one point, a woman had written to a pharmaceutical company twice, and she had asked them to please stop testing on animals, and she actually got a prison sentence. So, it's sort of like, how do you define public nuisance or harassment in law that doesn't become a catch-all for anyone who would like to say something out loud?
Yes. A lot of people on the right, Matt Goodwin, I think, would say that a protest on the left has to be quite radical, quite threatening to be threatened with censorship or shutting down. Whereas, a sort of fairly kind of mainstream conference on the right can be branded as far right. Do you think there's a disparity there?
Okay, so let's talk about the Palestine protests. So during those, there were fringe movements that were acting illegally. They were holding placards that were racist, they were anti-Semitic, and they were illegal. And we already had the legislation to prosecute those people. And there were questions about why the Metropolitan Police hadn't made arrests quicker. But eventually, actually, a lot of them were arrested. Some of them, arguably, were sort of brought in unfairly. But broadly speaking, you had members of Hizb ut-Tahrir who were there, who did get arrested. But also, that conference is very broad. And actually, Suella Braverman and Nigel Farage have very different politics when it comes to free speech and protest. Because Nigel Farage, for all intents and purposes, is a libertarian. And I can't imagine if he ever got into power, that he would ever try to curtail what was being said on the streets. And that's because he genuinely does fundamentally believe in your right to say something, no matter what side of the spectrum you're on. And you can see that from the sort of interviews that he takes. Like, he'll speak to a left-wing journalist in the same way he'll speak to a right-wing journalist. Suella Braverman seems to be quite hell-bent on making speech free for a certain type of opinion, an opinion that sort of resonates with her own. And it feels quite inconsistent.
Well, on that note, we'll end it. But Ava-Santina, thank you very much for Ava-Santina Evans, I should say. Thank you very much for coming on Spectator TV. Now, the tech company Meta sparked a furious reaction this week when it announced that it was reducing the age at which children can use WhatsApp, the communications platform, from 16 to 13. This move has clashed with a growing campaign in Britain, headed in part by Miriam Cates, the MP, to severely restrict or even ban smartphones entirely for children under 16. It's quite an interesting debate, and I'm delighted to be joined by Zoe Strimpel, the writer, who has written a piece about this for The Spectator in the last few days, and our editor, Fraser Nelson, who is unusually anti-libertarian on this issue, I believe, but we'll get into that. Zoe, let's start with you, because your article, while it doesn't discount all the harms that WhatsApp can do, that messaging can do, that iPhones can do, smartphones, I should say, you do conclude that it's unjust to deprive the under-16s of WhatsApp. Explain your argument a bit.
Well, I don't actually think the word unjust quite captures it. It's more like giving into a very adult urge to, sort of knee-jerk urge to say no and ban things without actually thinking, well, maybe there's a way we can make this work. So that's the first thing. But the main point there, it's not really, oh, it's unfair, other people can have it and children can't. I mean, you could apply that argument to, well, not to raise another thing that's being banned, but cigarettes. It's more that we have to get real. I mean, we are living now ever more rapidly in an age at which it's not optional to ban these things. It's just like, it's ridiculous. It's like banning, as I said in my article, the air. And so to me, it just seems entirely more sensible to have a, evolving and intelligent way of instilling in children basically how to use smartphones without exposing themselves to material that they themselves will be paying the price for later. The second point I tried to make, and here maybe is where just is more of a better word, is that banning chat is just, that's, again, how long is a piece of string? Chat is what teenagers do. Chat is what children do. It is how they develop who they are. It's how they develop their sense of language. It's how they keep up with their friends. It's how they figure out the world. And the point I made in the piece, and I don't want to fall into the trap of saying, well, there's really no change between the, people worried about the radio and they worried about videos and now they're worrying about the internet. Obviously, there's a singularity that's been reached with smartphones. But I think the fact is, banning the means of communication just seems such a bizarre thing to do. Shouldn't we be rather worrying about what it is that children have to communicate about, and therefore perhaps focus more on the ideological crap that so many teachers are throwing at them, or the boringness of so many lessons, or basically what's in their world seems much more important than whether they can message back and forth until the early hours. So that's my view.
Fraser, you are very against banning children from smoking later. Why do you not support the idea of letting them use WhatsApp now?
Well, I would describe myself as a liberal rather than a libertarian. I'm a kind of old-fashioned Adam Smith liberal, right? That's my political outlook. But when it comes to parenting, nobody can really argue that children have got these rights. I mean, children aren't allowed to do a whole bunch of things, smoke and drink, and they'll have to live under sort of parental authority. So I don't think it's necessarily a contradiction to be a liberal for consenting adults, but to be a little bit more concerned about what children have got the access of doing. And the reason that Facebook is acting is because there is a large amount of parental concern in America, triggered to studies showing fast deterioration in mental health, and an explosion in anxiety, in episodes of self-harm, even suicide attempts amongst young children. But all this has been documented in the book by Jonathan Haidt, The Anxious Generation, which has been released, and it's triggering political debate, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, Florida, for example, just, I think, bans smartphones for the under 14s. You've got some other states like Louisiana, Utah, that are requiring parental consent. So I think what we're seeing here is the social media giants realizing that there is research which links social media usage to mental health problems amongst children, and working out that there isn't that much of a case for children to be on these platforms, and quite a large case for them not being on them. So what they're doing now is they're simply moving before various legislatures in Europe and America start to move on them.
My question, sorry, just to dive in, is are people taking due account of the incredible benefits that smartphones have brought children and the sheer amount that they can learn from having access to, as I said in my piece, chess.com is an interesting example. Some teachers in US schools find they can't make anyone concentrate because they're all furiously playing chess on their phones. Rishi Sunak has tried to make chess a part of the national curriculum. So I don't dispute that there are genuine concerns and they're huge, or any of Fraser's unease. But I would say that in these conversations, I think we are at real risk of not, equitably looking at the upsides. The other thing I would say is that it's all very well banning, firstly, we're not being clear about whether we're talking about WhatsApp's age or smartphones more generally and social media. I don't consider WhatsApp a particularly social media. It's a messaging platform. The thing is, if we're going to do that, what are we doing? We're making it harder for children to talk to each other after school without seeing each other. That worked back in the day. If back in my day when we talked all day, we had landlines and we had separate lines, as I said in my piece, where someone could put you through, and there was a way less of a kind of breathing down the neck atmosphere around physically going and seeing someone. And in the US anyway, you can drive at 16. I don't see an equivalent set of measures changing here that enables children to keep chatting after school, perhaps into the night. So if you're going to ban WhatsApp and you're going to get all knickers in a twist about that, you've got to give them some other outlet for endless chatter, because that is what they need to do and that is what they should be doing. So that's one thing. I mean, in terms of the bad stuff and the anxiety and all the things that they encounter through proper social media, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, YouTube, that's a conversation I would also argue isn't about banning, but is about people making children interested in other things, basically. But
WhatsApp is not just a straightforward messaging service. I mean, it is social in the sense that you can have huge groups on there, and I know that children of my children's age are on these enormous groups with large parts of the rest of London. And it's the concern is what can get shared on there and what children can see as a result.
But how is that different from email? Wouldn't they just figure out that you can have enormous groups on email as well?
But that's not how it works. I mean, anybody who's got WhatsApp knows that you communicate in large groups, sometimes of 5 to 10, sometimes of 100 to 200, in a way that just isn't done on email. So that's part of it. I think the problem isn't the smartphone use per se, because of course you can do gaming and you can watch Netflix, you can do all sorts of things with your screen time. The studies show that the problem comes in when children get on social media apps, including WhatsApp, and that they message each other, and a strange sort of paradox takes place. They've got a large number of virtual friends, in inverted commas, most of whom they've never met, but the actual network of real friends shrinks. So you get a rise in loneliness. You get an increase in kids basically going up to the bedroom and being on their phone and calling it social. I'm not quite sure that they improves their communication skills either. Having looked at these messages, the fewer words, the better. They're not sentences or anything like it. And you end up with a situation where what we're seeing is the decline of unsupervised play, of children just being outside. That's the alternative to smartphones. It's called the real world. And I think we've seen a sort of slightly pernicious trend of what you might call helicopter parenting, where parents are a lot more anxious about what their kids might be getting up to when they're outside. And they shouldn't be, of course, because statistically their kids are far less likely to come to harm now than they were a generation ago. But nonetheless, a combination of more protective parenting has meant that kids are under the parental eye a lot more and messaging each other rather than forming the real life social skills of being in the real world. So you get a situation where you've got lots of digital friends, but weirdly you end up more lonely. And that after school, rather than meet up with each other, they'll go home and start to communicate in a way which isn't particularly good for developing real-world skills. In fact, studies show that it impedes real-world skills. It also absolutely impedes study. And again, there's a big link between how much time you spend on social media and how well you do in your exams and your likelihood of forming real-world connections. So I think this is what the concern is about, the digitization of childhood and the way that real-life interactions are being replaced by virtual ones in a way that isn't good for kids and will not bring them up to be better adjusted adults.
But have we had enough time yet to be able to make that conclusion? I mean, and also one of the key debates about, essentially epistemology today is digital real or not? I mean, you're drawing a very clear and ready line, which makes sense to us, born pre-internet and grew up pre-internet. But I think increasingly we have to look at the possibility that the sorts of slang messaging that makes sense to them, that their digital friends, isn't necessarily not real life skills. I mean, that's why people are in such a hurry to hire digital natives, because they've grown up on this. They understand the cadences. They produce the viral. They know what it is to go viral. They understand all this stuff. We don't. And so I'm hesitant to assume that the old binary that seems so obvious to us between internet life and offline life, is so clear. And the other thing I would say is that playing outside is all very idyllic and lovely. I'm not sure for lots of city kids that's entirely possible, but also we are talking about 13 to 16. That's a teenage age range where they aren't just out in the street playing hopscotch. People, this is what we used to do. I'm sure you did too, but I don't have much other reference point. But it wasn't playing outside. Sometimes it was playing outside, but by that age, it was sitting inside, often when parents weren't around, getting up to stuff or talking about stuff so it wasn't supervised play.
Perish the thought. I mean, isn't that exactly what you want kids to be doing? Getting up to stuff with each other, communicating in real life with a group of friends.
Well, I don't know, but I think it's not supervised play. It's teenagers being teenagers. And I'm just not sure that it's so different what they're talking about on WhatsApp. I don't know. They could make friends across the world and talk to them. Whereas, we were stuck with, Jesse in the next class or whatever, which was fine. But I actually probably would have been happier, and I'm sure I'm not alone in having a much wider range of possible friends, even online friends. You can have real friends and online friends.
Fraser, do you think, Zoe's touching on something there, because what we're talking about perhaps here is parental or middle class guilt, because a lot of us spend, I know you and I, partly because of work, mostly because of work even, spend a lot of time on our phones, and we're aware that our children are aware of it. And so we're trying to sort of ban something because we feel so bad about our own usage.
I see it slightly differently. For a start, it was wow, look at this device here. This will keep a kid quiet and occupied for a long amount of time. And walking around now, you can see, like, I was in the Westfield Centre the other day and saw there's these prams which have got a special holder for smartphones. So the kids, often 3 or 4, can just sit and play a game or swipe as they're being pushed around, rather than kicking off because the parents are shopping. Now, you might initially think, well, what's the harm in that? But then you find out when they grow up, the studies are certainly coming. Now, this is, to Zoe's point, this is why we're getting worried about it now, because only now are we starting to see the studies pointing to what can only be described as an epidemic of mental health amongst children, especially amongst teenage girls. Instagram in particular, with this focus it places on the image, on this kind of two-dimensional self. And I think that the more you find out about it, the more you find out that these tools are just too sharp for these young minds. Now, nobody is saying, I'm certainly not saying, let's ban them completely. The studies actually show that about 1 hour of social media a day, 1 to 2 hours, that isn't that bad for you. It's when you're looking at 6 hours, 8 hours, 9 hours a day. And this is what you're seeing in many, many cases in children in Europe and America. This is when you start to go off the deep end. Now, of course, you might say, well, shouldn't parents be trying to control this? And yes, you can. There's things like screen time. You can try and set it, but it requires quite a lot. And the excuse or the argument parents so often get is the kids saying, look, you can't take me off this smartphone because all the rest of my class are on these things. So you're excluding me socially. And that's when you need either a cohort of parents to get together and say, right, we're just simply not going to let these kids on their phones after a certain amount, so you can reduce the peer pressure. Or in the case of Florida and the other US states, you get governments coming in saying, we're going to ban it for under 14s or require parental consent for under 18s. I'm not quite sure what Europe and Britain is going to do in response, but there will be a response because the body of evidence linking social media amongst children to the impeding of learning and the increase in mental health issues is just so compellingly strong. But I think these devices are robbing them of their childhood, and it's time for us to give them back what was our birthright and that of all generations before us.
But we can't do that. That would be that's like saying it's time for us to give them back 1982 or 1975, or, you know, to give them back cars that run on, you know, I don't know, well, you have to have runner boards to make them work, or, you know, it's just that we can't. And also that past was awful for kids. So many children had, I mean, there was so much other stuff that was even worse that was wrong with that. And I suppose I question the convinced nature of the association between 100% correlation between smartphone use and teen mental health issues. Only having read recently Abigail Schreier's book Bad Therapy, where I actually interviewed her as well about it, and she had been convinced that it was all social media that was driving mental health crisis in young people. But now she's convinced that social media is a small part, well, not a small, but not the whole story, that the real problem, the underlying root of the problem is over pathologization of children. And so why are we monitoring them constantly for their mental health? Why are we constantly asking them how they feel? Why are we sending them to counselors, therapists, diagnosing them, giving them ADHD diagnoses, saying they're on the autism spectrum? And all of this stuff is as much of a problem, if not more, than smartphone use. And so I think when we think about, oh, how come it's so bad now when it was so much less bad then? Yes, there obviously is some absolute shift, and Schreier would agree. But I think it's like with anything, when you start being excessively aware and start zoning in on something, you will start to get a massive increase in reports of that thing. And I think that's what's happening. And I think the idea that teenage girls teenage girls have always, hence hysteria, hence Freud, hence anorexia. Now, you know, it's just the oldest story in the book. Are they in absolute terms worse off now? Some would say in absolute terms they've never been better. They have more choices, more opportunities, more encouragement from school. There are more girls going to university than ever before. They outnumber boys. So I think, you know, paying attention to the other bits of the picture are really important. The other thing is, one thing I find unpleasant is the assumption that children are somehow not subhuman or idiots. Yes, they have parental oversight is important. Am I glad my mother didn't let me watch more than an hour of TV a day on a 12-inch TV set? No, actually, it angered me, and now I spend all my time watching TV in order to get back at her for that. But I think that one can, you know, children aren't completely stupid in the sense that they are capable of understanding if you say to them, this is really bad for you. Like, a lot of children think smoking is really bad for me, so I won't do it. Plenty do. But I think you could, you know, it's not impossible that we can entrust them with some expectations and some, you know, firm guidance that isn't the first, you know, instinct isn't about banning them and punishing them and preventing them, but rather about making it, you know, really clear what is best for them. And then, you know, what they don't get, then you start bringing in the disciplinarian stuff.
Thank you very much, both. That's it for this week. I'll wave the Spectator at you one more time. Don't forget to take up the new offer and read all of our brilliant articles about everything that's going on in the world. You get 3 weeks of the Spectator for just £3, which is an incredibly good deal. Thank you very much for watching Spectator TV. Come back next time.